And they went to the Ishmaelites. They said to them, "Give us something to drink, we are thirsty." They brought them salted things in skins, bottles that were blown up with the air. They went to them, eat and drink. When one of them opened the skin and put it to his mouth, the air was in it burst forth and choked him, and it was written the oracle concerning Arabia. Can you see? So this term Arabia is being used, and this is the Talmud. This is a Jewish source. Babylonian Talmud. Here you have it again. The one who sees Ishmael in a dream, his prayer will be heard, and only Ishmael, the son of Abraham, but an Arab in general, know the one who sees a camel in the dream, death has been decreed upon him from heaven, and he has been saved. So basically, he's connecting Ishmael to where? To the Arabian Peninsula. Okay, so it's not Islam that came and connected Ismail or Ishmael with the Arabian Peninsula, and in particular Paran, the Arabian Peninsula. This seems to be continued from at least some level of biblical and Jewish information that there was there. You see, so there's more than a book of Jubilees. And Ishmael and his sons, the sons of Keturah, and their sons went together and dwelt from Paran to the entering in Babylon in all lands which is towards the east facing the desert. So it's telling you where it is now. It's towards the east facing the desert. And these mingled with each other, and the name was called Arabs and the Ishmaelites. Now, very, very interesting. You're seeing here, we're seeing that they're asking what's the evidence that Mecca and all this kind of thing. And it's usually Christians sometimes asking this question. You know, your evidence is your own books. The evidence is in the Jewish books. Now, we'll come to this maybe near the end, but there are two schools of historical or historians when it comes to the Bible. There's what you call the minimalists and what you call the maximalists. Okay? Now, the minimalists are those who, when they're looking at the early histories of, especially Old Testament prophets, really and truly anything but Moses after. Before Moses, there's scanty, if not in any evidence of any prophet. That's outside the biblical, or let's say religious books. You've got Moses, you've got David, you've got Solomon, you've got some other prophets, you've got the people of Israel. There's evidence of that, we'll come to that, outside of the Bible. Okay? So a minimalist is the one who, when he wants to understand the early histories of these people, they will not consult the Bible that much. They will consult it minimally. The maximalist will consult it more. So what I'm saying is that this standard of evidence, where we're looking at the Talmud and we're looking at the Bible, it would satisfy a more maximally orientated historian from the school of thought perspective. But it's still something. You can't say, oh, there's no evidence of Mecca. It's being attached to Ismail and the Arabs and so on. There is clearly evidence in there, and this is just some. I can give you more. But for brevity and conciseness, I only gave you some information. So when Dan Gibson says, oh, there's nothing connected to Mecca, well, actually, there's things connected to Mecca way before. Ismail is connected to Mecca. Why is it coincidence? How could it be a coincidence that this narrative in the Quran, which locates Abraham and locates Ismail in particular, and Hagar, Hajar, it locates these people in the Arabian Peninsula. There's ample evidence in Jewish sources and in biblical sources that connect them in the same area. Why there? If Muhammad ﷺ is meant to have no relevance, if this is not actually a continuation, because the story of Islam is that Muhammad ﷺ was a continuity from previous prophets, and that he was from the sons of Ismail, as we're going to cover. But if this story was vacuous and it made no sense, bereft of any historical quality, if this story was such, then how could you find any evidence that corroborates it in their books? If this was some kind of made up story, this doesn't make any sense. Why would a Jew put that? Why would a Jew want to put the Arabs in there, in his Talmud, of all places? One of his most sacred places. He puts a Jew, but Ismail's in Arab. I know. Sorry to say, we're not buying it. No one's going to buy this. Dan Gibson and talking about, look at Petra. Let's be honest about the situation, man. And I was reading something interesting, and wallahi, I found this extremely interesting in it. Because it's become fashionable in the Orientalist world, some of the anti-Islamic apologists. And that's what they are. They pose as academics, but really they're apologists for Christianity, or they're anti-Islam apologists. For example, Stephen Shoemaker. And he wrote a book. I'm not going to advertise this book, but I'm going to mention some of the things he wrote in there, because I found it really interesting. You know, in the Quran, for example, you see the story of Jesus, okay? And you will know that the story of Jesus in the Quran is different from the ones in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Especially that, you know, Mary, in chapter 19, you know, in Surah Maryam, she went to the palm trees, and then the dates came on her, and she shook the palm, and she shook the palm trees, and you know the story. This story, by the way, is not in the Gospels. You will not find it in the Matthew, Mark, Luke. You will not find it in the Gospels of the Christians. But you will find it somewhere else. A close match to this story, you'll find it in the Gospel of James. Now, Gospel of James. Not the book of James, the Gospel. Now, who is James? Just for the sake of argument, or just for the understanding. James actually is meant to be, according to them, not according to us, but is meant to be the brother of Jesus Christ. They say he was the brother. They say Joseph the carpenter had a brother, had a son, and that son was James. Anyways, there was the Gospel of James. This particular book was not being read, and according to Stephen Shoemaker, and I haven't done as much research on this matter as he has, he's trying to locate this once again on goals and shooting themselves in the foot. And we saw in the beginning when Patricia Croner was talking about the landscape and the geography. You're going to see even more here. We're going to see even more with this. That really, he's trying to locate Islam, or the formation or development of Islam in the early, let's say, time, like 50 years at the time of Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan. And he said, look, there's a church. It's a church in Jerusalem. It's called the Kathisma Church. This particular church in Jerusalem has very specific notions about Mary. In fact, you know the tree in the Quran that's mentioned that shake the tree and the dates will come down? They consider that tree to be even holy tree. They consider that tree to be a holy tree. And you know where it's located? Think about it. It's meant to be where the historical Jesus is. Like near Bethlehem or Jerusalem or whatever it may be. So it's actually meant to be, if you're being a historian about it, if you want to know what Jesus said, let's go to the geographic location. This is closer to where he lived. And listen to what he said. And I'm going to read exactly what he says. He says this version of how Jesus was born and Mary, it's so specific that Muhammad couldn't have known about it. It's not at that time, you know, you'll see. I'm going to read it. He couldn't have known about it. And even, you know, Ya Ukhta Harun, it's mentioned in the Quran. Oh, sister of Aaron. And some of the Orientalists, they say, that shows you that there was confusion with Aaron and stuff. He says the sister of Aaron is mentioned in that church. Look what they're doing, bruv. They're making our job easier. So, okay, maybe she had a sister called, her brother called Aaron. And now we have information of that. Huh? I'm going to read it to you now. Stephen Shoemaker. And he thinks by saying this, he's making a case against Islam, trying to show the development of Islam. And what he's actually showing is that it's impossible for the Prophet ﷺ to have had information that was connected in Jerusalem in a very specific church. And I saw an interview with him, with another professor or lecturer called Reynolds, or whatever, I can't remember his first name, Gerald Reynolds or something like that. And he's saying there's no chance. He said, could a storyteller have told him? He said, there's no storyteller that can go into that much detail. But you know, he went to Syria when he was younger and he done this, and he said, there's no chance. This is a very specific church in a very specific place, and this information came out. So I'm going to read out what he says. Because, as I say, they shoot themselves in the foot without realizing. It says, the case of the Kathisma Church and the Quranic nativity tradition in 9:22-28, Surah Maryam, which I have discussed elsewhere in some detail, leaves little question that we must approach the Quranic text as a corpus of traditions to absorb Jewish and Jewish and Christian traditions in the decades after the believers conquered and occupied the Near East. In these 7 verses, the Quran gives highly compressed account of the birth of Jesus that depends on distinctive combination of Christian nativity traditions that is uniquely found outside the Quran only in the liturgical practices of a particular Marian shrine just outside of Jerusalem, the Kathisma Church. In the vast world of late ancient Christianity, it's only at this church that we find the world of late ancient Christianity. It is only at this church that we find the combined 2 early Christian traditions that appear in the Quran's account of nativity. Christ's birth in a remote location rather than in Bethlehem, and Mary's refreshment by a miraculous palm tree and spring. For good measure, one must add the liturgical traditions of this same shrine also explicitly name Mary as the sister of Aaron. See what he's saying here. He thinks he's making a case against Islam. He's saying, look, he must have borrowed it. He must have been around after. He must have borrowed it from these guys. There's no way they would have known about that church. Very specific church, very specific liturgy. Can you see how he's digging a grave for himself? You're making the case for me, my friend. He couldn't have known that information. You're right. And that information is most likely closest to the historical tradition of Jesus. Why? Because geographically it's closest to him, where he probably lived. He didn't live in Roman Empire. Jesus, there is good evidence. Most historians, even atheists, acknowledge his historicity, by the way. But if his historicity is true, then most historians will say go to his geographic location, go close to where he lived. And when you do that, you find the story closest to what? The Quran. And according to this guy, who's an anti-Muslim Orientalist, he's saying there's no way the Prophet could have known that. Let's see what he says. At last, providing a clear solution to this well-known puzzle of the Quran, the correspondence between the Quranic passage, and we continue, and the tradition and liturgical practice of the Kathisma Church is simply too close to be a coincidence. Clearly the Quran knows and expects its audience to know this particular configuration of Christian nativity tradition. Not really. But that's what he wants to say. It's like he's trying to locate it outside of Arabian Peninsula. He said, no way, it must be. It's like the same argument that Chrono was saying. Why is he mentioning olives? Why is he mentioning pomegranates? Why is he mentioning seas? Why is he mentioning the Sabbath? It's meant to be a Meccan surah. He's mentioning it because the primary audience is not the only audience. Why is he mentioning these details of that particular church? He's mentioning it because he couldn't have known that information and he got it from a different source. So listen to it, it continues. Nevertheless, there is no evidence that this particular fusion of traditions was known even among Christians. Listen to what he's saying. This particular fusion, there's no evidence that even Christians could not have known that, who lived outside of Jerusalem and Bethlehem. It is therefore hard to believe, if not entirely unthinkable. Look what he's saying. He thinks he's making a case against Islam. He's making a very strong case. He is better apologist, Islamic apologist, than any I've ever heard. SubhanAllah, he's trying to harm Islam. He's really aiding it. He's saying it's unthinkable. He's saying, no, he's a historian. He's looking. We trust this guy. He has no connection to Islam. When he's doing his interview with Reynolds or whatever, he's got Christian pictures in the back and crosses and stuff. You can see his ghil and anger towards Islam. He's angry towards anyone who has a confessionary narrative. This is what he's saying. Wallahi, listen to what he's saying. It is therefore hard to believe, if not entirely unthinkable, that the Kathisma would somehow have been widely known among Muhammad's non-literate followers in the central Hijaz, so that they could have had any chance of understanding the compressed and elliptic reference to them in Quran 19:22. Indeed, it boggles the mind to imagine that somehow this distinctively Jerusalemite combination of nativity traditions could have been widely known and understood by the hundreds or so illiteral early Meccan surahs, particularly when we find no evidence of any knowledge of this particular configuration of traditions anywhere else in late ancient Christianity, other than the Kathisma. The suggestion that somehow this distinctive mixture of traditions could have reached Muhammad and the citizens of Mecca and them alone in their barren hamlet strains credibility in the extreme. Because he wants to show that the Quran was not authored by Muhammad, it was authored by a conglomerate of authors and they came together and there was development and added and this. Instead what he's showing is, in fact, he couldn't have written this because that information couldn't have come to him. And that is a Quranic argument for the veracity of Islam.